We'll make a start to our session. Welcome everybody. My name is Carsten Zigwart from the University of Waikato. I'll be hosting this session today with some researchers that are active in COVID-19. Just some of those house rules. If you can just have your microphone on mute during the session, unless you happen to be asking a question near the end of the session. And also have your cameras turned off in order to save on bandwidth. Some people will be connecting in areas where the bandwidth will not be as generous as it is in some other areas, and then just keeping the videos down as a way of controlling that part of it. And just a note and a reminder again, we are recording the session, and the session will be made available online later on. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional lands of the Tānewi people and meeting with you on that land from the Waikato region, and I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, both past and present. I also like to acknowledge that the other people are meeting on other traditional lands right across the world at the moment, and we want to acknowledge those people groups as well. Just as a background, COVID-19 has brought to us a real unprecedented time and a real challenging time, and it's changed significantly how we deliver higher education at our own institutions and the learning for our students engaged in work integrated learning. Our economies are definitely struggling. We're finding that business is struggling. It is a challenge for businesses to take on, for example, our work placement students while they're struggling themselves in order to keep their own staff. So it is a really unusual and challenging time that we're in at the moment. The focus of this session is around research, and we were very fortunate that we had researchers who were active in research and work integrated learning, but have adjusted their research in order to accommodate the context of COVID-19. And given there's been considerable discussion about work integrated learning and how that has changed on the current climate, it is really important that we inform these discussions with research thinking and scholarly debate that sits around that. Now, various research that's been occurring in the context of COVID-19 is that we're doing research on tracking employers' views and the positioning on taking students for work integrated learning and for placements. We're looking at research that is perhaps not around the conventional work integrated learning, for example, group projects, simulated learning, remote WIL, as well as a blended context between the two of them. And there's also research occurring around ensuring the quality of the learning experience for the students during this time, both on their experience itself, but also for the learning outcomes. So it is exciting that there is research occurring in these particular spaces and an opportunity to share some of these activities that are occurring at the moment. Now, today we have a panel of 4 researchers who are doing research in COVID-19 in relation to work integrated learning. We have Dr. Bonnie Dean from the University of Wollongong, Australia, Dr. Baratin Kamparit from the Suriname University of Technology, Dr. Karen Nolte from Drexel University, United States, and also Dr. Jadine Pretty from the University of Waterloo, Canada. And I would like to welcome our panelists who are here today and have made this time available. And just to have a context of the scope of our international spread, we've actually got people who are very early stages of the morning and also people who are late stages of the evening as well. So thank you for making yourself available during the time that's not necessarily your normal working hours. We will be asking the panelists some questions and they'll go through a process of introducing themselves and giving a bit of context about the research they are doing and perhaps some indication about the early findings that they have as part of their research. We've got Anna keeping an eye on the chat function. So if you have a question during this time, then please just put it in the chat function and Anna will be monitoring those, and if needs be, we'll jump in there and ask that question to the panelists as well. So welcome everybody. Can I just ask the panelists to give a bit of introduction about themselves and the context that they're in. And if I could start with Bonnie, if I may, if you were willing to introduce yourself. And
Of course, thank you so much, Carsten. And hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to see you all here. And thank you for joining us today. I feel quite humbled to be approached to talk to you as a WIL researcher, because I don't see myself as someone who's quite experienced in this space, but I do see myself as someone who what I might like an experience I certainly make up for with enthusiasm. This is definitely an area I enjoy, and if you get me talking about WIL research for long enough, eventually, and you'll be like, okay, Bonnie, that's enough. So let me tell you a bit about myself. Sorry, Carsten, I'm talking too much already. So my name is Dr. Bonnie Dean. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and that's on the south coast of Australia. I'm also on the ASIN Board of Directors, and ASIN is Australia's National Association for Work Integrated Learning. So at UOW, at the University of Wollongong, I'm a teaching learning specialist. So I've worked in the Central Learning and Teaching Unit, designing pedagogy and working with academics on teaching skills, and I sit beside academics and industry partners and students to co-design curriculum, and that's the space that I love being in. And of course, during the last few months, that has certainly involved around ways to redesign courses using technology. I started out though in WIL, about 10 years ago now, designing and facilitating our internship program for business students, and that's where my passion for work integrated learning, practice and research really started. So in terms of research, I've got kind of two domains that I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in the student learning side, and secondly, I'm really interested in WIL pedagogy and the way that we design work integrated learning experiences for students like inside curriculum. So that's me.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for that. Veratine, could you perhaps introduce yourself as well and just explain the context that you are in at the moment?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
Hello, everyone. I am Buratin Kampirat. I am Assistant Professor in Educational Research at Suranari University of Technology in Thailand. My courses are concerning about research methodology, advanced and applied multivariate statistical analysis, both of undergraduate and postgraduate in engineering student and information technology. And I joined more than 15 years with European Educational Research Association. And now I am co-convener of EERA in Network 11. My research interests focus on employability, career, and student development, assessment of student competencies using structural equation modeling and multi-level model. I joined with WIL research and know about cooperative education more than 20 years. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Veratine. It sounds like you are definitely a very busy person. It's great to have you here. Karen, if you're able to perhaps explain a little bit the context that you're in at the moment as well, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Karen Knowlton from Drexel University in Philadelphia in the US. And I echo Bonnie's, I think, excitement in having landed in the WIL researcher communities very unexpectedly, I think, but intentionally. And like she is doing, following that excitement of what's out there, what else can we find out? So that context for me at Drexel, I want to talk a little bit about the place because that makes it a bit different. Drexel is a large 24,000 student tier 1 research institution in the US. We're in the East Coast. So we're not quite locked down now, but trust me, we'll be back soon. And we have a robust co-op program. 91% of our students take co-op, and only 91% of our students take at least one 6-month co-op, but the majority of our students take 3 6-month co-ops. So when they graduate, they've had 18 months of full-time work under their belt. And our co-op program is, and this is where it gets back to me, is centralized, and we are working now, and this is what I'm excited to be working with, on integrating that with teaching and learning at the department level in ways that we simply haven't done. We haven't needed to do, we felt, and what's exciting now has been over the last few years, seeing how we can make those changes happen. And just the other piece of the context, and this isn't my context, but this is our context, is that in our spring-summer co-op, we have 2 co-op cycles. One begins, for us, it began right as the pandemic lockdown started, the end of March, and it's still going. Those students are in that 6-month co-op, so they were sort of fresh into it and are in the middle of it. Our next, and in that cycle, we lost about 20% of our co-op opportunities. Our fall winter looks like it's going to be just about the same. partly because, as we said, we will probably be heading back somewhere towards lockdown, and because our co-op employers are a little concerned about the demographics of the students and allowing them into workplaces that are just entering up. So that's a little bit more about the context than me, but we'll get into the research that I find fun later. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. It's yeah, and certainly I've acknowledged it's a challenging context that you're in at the moment, and it'd be unfortunate to move back into a context of a lockdown, but it seems like a reasonable reality that will happen. And we'll come back to some of those contexts later on. Judine, if I can get you to introduce yourself as well in the context, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the new institution that you're part of as well.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Karsten, and very excited to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm Judine Preddy, the director of what is now called the Work-Learn Institute at the University of Waterloo. It was formerly known as WATCASE, the Waterloo Center for the Advancement of Cooperative Education. I'm also the executive chair of the international research community that WACE supports. Similar to Karen's description of Drexel, Waterloo is also a research intensive university. It was actually founded with the model of co-op as part of its core feature, and it is still one of the key characteristics that drives our recruitment. So when our incoming students are asked if they would have come to Waterloo if not for co-op, 70% of them, 70% of them say no, they wouldn't have. That's a pretty powerful driver within the institution about the importance of this model for our students and for everyone. We support over 21,000 work terms last year. Our work terms are 4 months. They're paid full-time work experiences for our students. And like Karen described the model at Drexel, our students typically complete 4 to 6 4-month work experiences during the completion of their undergraduate degree. We are based on and part of WIL Canada, our national association, and so the model that we have is based on WIL's co-op accreditation. As far as research, I'm very fortunate to run a research unit that is focused on research related to co-op and other forms of work integrated learning, because our institution has so much invested in the brand of co-op. They followed that up with the notion that we should be conducting research on it to explore, understand, and to continue to advance the practice.
Awesome, thank you, Judine, and it's great to have someone here from Waterloo, because Waterloo is really in that leading position on the practice of cooperative education. And that history of that university is definitely phenomenal. Bonnie, if I can return to you, in regards to the research you're doing related to COVID-19 and the context of work integrated learning, perhaps you can explain a little bit more about what the focus of your research currently is.
Sure thing. So like many researchers, I'm in various stages of various research projects. So one of the areas I'm interested in is work integrated learning leadership in universities' responses to strategic priorities, particularly around work integrated learning. So that's a research project that I'm running with colleagues at the University of Wollongong, including Associate Professor Michelle Eady, who is here today. And we have a book chapter coming out in the ASIN publication, which is edited by Sonia Ferns, who is here, and Anna Rowe and Karsten as well. So we're excited to see that work being published, looking at the way universities address work integrated learning in terms of their leadership models. So whether or not they take centralized approaches or more of a distributed leadership model. So that's one part of my research, but I suppose the bulk of my research is really centered around non-placement work integrated learning. So looking at alternative and innovative models, the way that we can embed work integrated learning into existing curricula. So that's ways of doing work integrated learning, which is other than, say, a placement model. So what we're seeing is a trend before COVID-19 towards these more these innovative and alternative models of work integrated learning. So we started a research project on that last year, looking at the way that we might imagine scaffolding work integrated learning across a curriculum rather than as, say, a capstone unit at the end of a degree, which for those of us in institutions who haven't probably dedicated as much resourcing into work integrated learning longer placements, that's been the strategy that has been followed by our institutions. So we're looking at ways that we might give students various opportunities through work integrated learning projects and sims and consultations and other forms of innovative models as well. So my research in that space is really exploring the different ways that that might be addressed, and also the diversity of ways that it will be addressed according to different disciplines. So what we're seeing is that work integrated learning looks quite different in different disciplines, and so I really want to unpack that a little bit more and find out why it looks like that and how we can support academics to conceptualize the curriculum to engage with work integrated learning a lot more. So very soon, probably, I think, hopefully within the next month, Michelle, Edie, Venkat, Yananandram and myself will have a special issue published in the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice. And the special issue is on advancing non-placement WIL across the curriculum. So keep your eyes out for that one. We've got some awesome contributions from people around the world in Australia and New Zealand as well. But so coming back to COVID-19 research, so given that I have experience in designing curriculum, all sorts of curriculum, but also work integrated learning activities, when COVID-19 happened, it was really what we saw was this, obviously this move towards remote learning. And what we also found was those who had placement models, look, this was a really challenging time. Those who had, say, alternative models, such as, simulations or virtual WIL, those models, really stood the test. And we found that in many respects, that was easy for industry partners to maintain engagement during that time as well. So with Matthew Campbell from QUT, that's Queensland University of Technology, we put our heads together to write a scholarly paper for an upcoming issue in IJ-WIL, in International Journal of Work Integrated Learning. And that paper really looks at the way that, look, work integrated learning has been changing for some time. And we certainly have been noticing these trends into exploring different models. But what we've really seen in COVID-19 is just this perpetuation. So COVID-19 has just been that catalyst for innovation. So I've been really blessed to talk to a lot of work integrated learning practitioners over the last few months with my involvement with ASIN. And I've seen, and we've talked about the struggles of what it looks like to put a placement online and what it looks like to put other types of WIL activities online. And so in the paper that we really just wanted to unpack a little bit was to talk about the transformation of work and how we really needed an alignment of work integrated learning activities to ensure that we're also moving forward with this transformation of work practice. And we do that by looking at the way that we can engage students in authentic roles, authentic professional roles. So we might need to distance the idea of place, because place-based learning was particularly challenging, well, it currently is particularly challenging, but what we can still do is engage students in authentic professional practices. So, you talk to colleagues in a range of different disciplines, and you can see the way that in many cases, those workplaces has transformed. So thinking through what that looks like. And then, look, that was a scholarly paper. And so that has really sort of kicked us off. And then I suppose the next step from there is we really want to start looking into what does quality look like in non-placement work integrated learning. And that's a, to be continued discussion.
That's awesome. Thank you, Bonnie. And I see that Michelle has shared a document in the chat room that's related to that, so people can download that and use that. It's I can't quite work out which document it is, but if it's one I'm thinking it's a very useful one to that'll be a useful resource. Now, Bonnie, if I can ask you a quick question related to the work you're doing, particularly on the non-placement WIL side of it. I'm assuming you're reliant on a particular platform, technological platform, in order to make that happen, or maybe a variety of them. Perhaps you can give us a bit of insight on what that might be.
Yeah, look, what we've seen is a range of different platforms being used, but also a different range of pedagogical approaches being used. And look, just to offer some of my own thoughts in terms of where this is happening is what we've actually seen is that there's been a move to more bespoke approaches. So going to an industry partner and actually asking them, you know, what will work for you, and then talking to students instead of going, well, what's going to work for you? So we've seen a lot of flexibility in work integrated learning models that we probably haven't seen before. Previous to this and the research that has led up to this, we've been looking at trying to classify and identify certain models and approaches, whereas now they're merging, and we're seeing more hybrid approaches also come about, and they're being redesigned as well to make sure that it works for everyone. I think what we've seen in the last few months has been a large amount of sort of experimentation and response. And what I'm really curious about is what's going to come next. I'm really curious about what will stay and what will be let go of. That's what, and particularly when it comes to student learning, that's the space that I'm intrigued about. So can we separate the idea of place-based learning with student learning, or is there another way that we can conceive of learning that puts it in a completely different space that's still authentic work practice?
That's awesome. Thank you, Bonnie. I must admit, one of the great strengths that we have in work integrated learning is that it is diverse and it is quite flexible. And given the context that we're in at the moment, that strength is definitely coming into play. It's lovely. Thank you for sharing that, Bonnie. Baratine, if I can get you to explain a little bit about the research that you're doing and a bit of insight about that research that you've found so far already.
Okay, in Thailand during lockdown, the National Research Funding Organization asked for many research projects on COVID-19, including influence on student skill and reskill, forecasting short-term, mid-term, and long-term for individual development caused by COVID. I thought a lot of research topics to submitting research fund, and then I stopped on the topic about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic towards career shocks and career future perspective for students and new graduates in Thailand, a comparative study between WIL and non-WIL students. Then, around 3 weeks ago, I applied my research proposal for a grant. I developed this topic because based on a lot of literature reviews show that, first, COVID-19 crisis is a highly disruptive and extraordinary unexpected event to our career, not only students. And COVID caused new graduate and WIL students who are working in the workplace to experience career shock, which career shock can significantly positive and negative effect on career development process, career pathways, and their employability. Second, career shock during and after COVID as psychological characteristic is associated with personal and environmental factors. Third, mental well-being of our students is important. Investigative report, more than half of students had anxiety and depression since the beginning of the COVID. Therefore, the research question under my study are, first, what are the indicators for measuring career shock caused by unexpected events and COVID-19? Second, how has the outbreak of COVID affected patterns of career shocks, confidence in employability skill, career decision self-efficacy, and career future? And the last question, I would like to know what are the difference and similarity in the level of these attributes between WIL and non-WIL students during and after COVID-19.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much. And yes, certainly career choices are going to be really interesting to see how that plays out for our students working through the system at the moment. and subsequently after they graduate. And likewise along the lines of what skills they're going to bring into that graduate space, given that their learning experiences is so remarkably different now than it was in previous years. And certainly that whole digital online learning and digital workspace or virtual workspace is going to have an important part to play in the future. And I like that you've also got to focus on the mental well-being of students. And I know many of us are focused on how to make our programs work and in order to have placements, but we need to be very mindful that a lot of our students are experiencing significant stress during this time. And our students don't quite have the same level of work, of life experiences as we may have had. And even though we are struggling in that space, we need to be mindful that our students are quite likely struggling even more in that area. So it sounds like a really fascinating work, fascinating research focus. It's going to be really interesting to see your research output coming through. So thank you for that. Yes. I'd like to shift on to Karen, and if Karen, if you could explain a little bit about your research context and focus and perhaps a bit of a glimpse into what it is that you're finding at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So because I work at Drexel, where we have such a robust co-op program, we also have really robust data, which we're lucky. I had done some research earlier on some questions that we ask students at the end of co-op. What skills do you use? What are the top 5 skills that you use? What do you want to work on when you get back? And some qualitative questions that we ask, free response questions of employers, basically what do students do well and what do students do poorly? So we had done that earlier for just one college. We've now gone and gathered data for the entire university. We have 1,180 that we've just gone through and coded to see what's happened for the 19 spring summer co-op. We will have in January the 20 spring summer co-op, and we'll be able to compare the two and say, what did students say that they used that was different? Or did they just use some of the stuff that was the same more? What did employers have to say, and who did they have to say it about? Did they talk about different cohorts differently? When we're fully online, did that silence some voices? Did that make other voices more powerful? So we have the ability now, I think, to pull out some of the cohorts that we had already looked at and to say, what did it mean for us? Because this was, and this is part of the context that I forgot to mention, we had never allowed virtual or online co-ops before. So this was a total sea change. This also required more conversations than we have traditionally had between Steinbright and departments, programs, and colleges, which was a great inroad for us, because part of the question was, if your student is one of the 20% that doesn't get co-op, do you need to change your plan of study? Because that's in there. What are we offering? What are we doing? So for us, it's really opened conversations that we've been trying to crack open. And hopefully this first research question is fun because we have pre and post data, and we'll be able to look at that. The other one that we had already, a colleague and I, who's a linguist, Barbara Hookia, and I had just finished doing qualitative coding on the reflective analysis that we put in 2010 that students write at the end of their work, looking for, now, you haven't had fun until you have a composition person and a linguist deciding whether we go with Denise Jackson's pre-professional or we say, well, it's really professional. So spent far too much time talking about that. But what we were doing was pulling out the pieces of these identities that we're seeing within the reflective analyses, as well as other pieces that have to do not with just fit, belonging, social capital, all of these components, but with academic links. Because we haven't stressed it, we need a baseline for how often do they notice it and say it and do it, so that we'll have a sense of what we're doing moving forward. So we finished that. Again, this was for the 2018, and as soon as we have our data in January, we're gonna look and see, and some of the questions, we talked briefly before about the mental health of students. And one, I was a senior assessment specialist at Educational Testing Service for a long time, in charge of large-scale writing assessment. So I want to know, what does our writing show when we're going through this stress? What story are we making up about this? And I think that's the other piece that I think is fascinating. We start in the middle of uncertainty, and we know that WIL experiences in general are engender uncertainty. Students move into something new, and that's where learning and growth occurs, and that's wonderful. This spring summer term for us was that on steroids. As students are, as all of our students, we're trying to decide, are we safe? Are we comfortable? Let alone, can I do a good job? Can I get to know my coworkers? And do I like what I'm doing? So to have this window to be able to play with some of those questions, I'm excited by. Let's see, and the next thing that we're doing is really just in the beginning stages. Judine and I actually are thinking about doing, trying to understand a little bit more about the links between traditional teaching and learning centers and work integrated learning. So where are there traditional centers? Where are there not? Where are they linked in ways that we don't yet understand? And we know that we did a lot of faculty training around teaching during the spring summer term, but did we do any of that kind of support, and what did it look like if we did it for WIL employers? So those are the three areas, and as I said, I'm fortunate that I have this huge data set that I can tap into.
Yeah, you're definitely in a very fortunate position to having that amount of data available, both for pre and post as well. And it'd be fascinating to see what those differences are that are coming through, and also what isn't different, because even when there are no differences, that's going to be fascinating with this research as well. I mean, how much have we been able to keep the same? Are the learning experiences similar, or are they not? It'd be fascinating. It sounds like you've got a number of publications coming our way eventually, which it's going to be great to see. Thank you, Karen. That's awesome. I need to shift over to Judine, and Judine's doing some research in this space as well. So Judine, perhaps you can explain a little bit more about the research you're doing in the area, the various projects you've got on the go, and a bit of a glimpse about what you're finding at the moment.
Sure. Thank you. So when COVID hit in Canada, there were 8,000 Waterloo Co-op students employed in organizations around the globe. And so obviously it was a significant disruption for the students, for the employers, for the co-op staff who were helping them in the case of students who were employed internationally, helping them get home. But from the research perspective, it really did present a really interesting and unique opportunity, and that more than 5,000 of those 8,000 transitioned to working from home. So with the help of their employers and the co-op staff, they moved their work from home. And different than Karen's semester setup at Drexel, our term was from January till April. So essentially the students had half of their work term in a normal in-person setting, and then 5,000 of them transitioned to working from home. And so we were really interested in exploring the experience of those students who made the transition to working from home. In particular, understanding what factors seem to affect that transition positively and negatively potentially. And we really wanted to dig into, because this window of opportunity existed where we could look at what work and what interactions the students had been having in the workplace prior to the disruption, and then looking at how that changed in a remote work setting. Now, we have the obvious caveat here that we were all sorting out in March how to work effectively in a remote setting. So that obviously is going to affect the results that we got from students. But we really did feel like there was going to be no other time where we would have this chance to look at, the same student in the same role, in the same organization, and then in these two different contexts, one working in person and one being remote. So we wanted to learn as much as we could, as quickly as we could, because obviously with the size of our co-op program, there's going to be a tremendous impact of this kind of disruption, and it's going to continue for the foreseeable future. And we want to be able to provide support to those people who are helping our employers, as well as the students and the employers themselves. The other thing that seems pretty obvious is that in the reading and work that we've been doing related to the future of work, so reading the reports about the ways in which work is going to change, COVID-19 has certainly accelerated one aspect of that, which is a remote and distributed work team. And so we didn't see the findings of this research as being limited to the impact of COVID, but more likely relevant as our WIL and co-op programs evolved. So we used a mixed methods approach. We designed a survey to investigate the difference between the work that students were doing before the disruption and after. We investigated things like the priority of the tasks they were given, the complexity of the tasks they were given, and the support they were receiving, and asked them to talk about the work those dimensions on the work prior and post. We were able to use measures that we had come up with in previous exploratory research, and we're fortunate to get more than 1,000 responses from students within a 48-hour window on that survey. So that was very exciting for us. And as part of that survey, the last question was whether they would be willing to be followed up follow up with an interview with us, where we could ask some more to gain a deeper appreciation of what that transition had looked like for them. And so we conducted 50 interviews, one-on-one, online at the end of April and beginning of May. So those two sources sort of provide the basis for the research the analysis and writing that we're doing right now. The one little tidbit that I would give, and maybe others already know this, but this was a learning that came by accident for us, was we needed to use WebEx. That was the platform that was supported by our tech department. So we used WebEx to conduct these one-on-one interviews, and it has a transcript feature. So we recorded, and the transcripts were immediately available after the interview, and I would say probably with an accuracy of 85 to 90%. So not only did we not need to invest the time or money in doing the transcriptions ourselves, but they were then right there ready for us to analyze the beginning of May. So a little bit on the preliminary findings. Again, there's a fair amount of interest in us turning the findings around as quickly as we can, so that we can be benefiting from what we're learning as we go. The measures that students reported related to what they felt they were contributing and what they felt they were learning in a pre-COVID, so face-to-face versus a post-COVID, it did decrease with the remote at working. So they did report lower levels of feeling they were contributing and lower levels of learning. One of the pieces of advice that we've given to employers based on that finding is that it may be harder for students in the remote setting to understand the meaning of the work that they're being given. It may be harder for them to know how that's connected to the team's mission or the organizational goal as a whole. And so it may be more important in a remote setting for employers to be really clear about why students are being given work, so that they do understand and appreciate the meaning of the contribution that they're making. With respect to learning, that's one that will be interesting to watch, as to whether that was sort of a temporary as everybody's adjusting to it, or whether this term, where students were onboarded remotely and have done their whole work term remotely, whether we would see similar things there. Another interesting piece was that the time that they reported spending with colleagues related to interacting on tasks didn't decrease substantially between the in-person and the online, but students' reports of support went down. And so that's an aspect that we've dug into a little bit further in the interviews to understand what is the disconnect between time spent with people and feelings of support. And what we think is happening is that the formal interactions are still occurring. So the weekly meetings or the things that need to be done related to a specific task, but that the informal pieces aren't happening. So people aren't stopping by to check on, see how the student's doing. They're not having lunch together. And so it's those areas where students are then reporting lower levels of support. We asked students about the advice that they would have for employers and the advice they would have for future students. The advice for employers was more about the informal check-ins, so involving the student in any virtual social events or helping them feel part of the team. They also mentioned needing help in some cases with setting up their remote work environment, whether that was hardware or software. And then lastly, the students just recommended, not surprisingly, that they want to be provided with meaningful work. And there's a concern there that won't be the case in a remote setting. the advice they had for fellow students was to be flexible and adaptable. To your point, Karen, we asked them about the skills that were most important, that they felt they were using the most in the work remote environment. Communication was top, but then initiative and self-direction were the next two. And I think there's a new level of initiative that's going to need to be taken, because the student's going to have to be more explicit about raising their hand to help with things, or you know, saying I could do more. They're not around a table anymore to do that with employers face to face. They also suggested that fellow students need to have a positive perspective. They need to be conscious of what this moment in time is enabling them to learn, as opposed to focusing on what they're missing or lacking. And the last was related to the initiative, really investing in mentors and building networks. So taking the time to do that themselves. It may not happen as naturally as it would have in the face-to-face setting. So we are in the process of writing pieces of this up for the WIL special issue. And we also, our Work Learn Institute has a Twitter and LinkedIn account. So we'll be posting as we have more to share. We'll be posting there if people want more information.
I'm going to completely, sorry, Carsten, for butting in. Judine, this is just such an ideal opportunity to ask you a question. So what recommendations would you have then for those who are designing these types of WIL experiences for the educators?
Yeah, I think a lot comes down to looking at what meaningful work is to students, how they feel they can be making a contribution and learning at the same time. And I think that's going to vary by type of WIL. In our case, the employers are paying the student. That changes the dynamic of what is going to be expected. And it will be very difficult to sustain our program if students aren't continuing to contribute in this way. So that's very much at the forefront, is for us understanding what can we learn that's working well in remote work to be able to make suggestions to employers about. But I think we're still in the preliminary stages of understanding the differences in that remote work and what can be how to design it, best design it.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jillian. I think most of us have probably just now Googled WebEx and found a new way of doing our interviews in the near future. That sounds, I certainly will be Googling that and see if I can have access to that. So, and I'll open up for questions, and if people want to post a question in the chat, that'll be great. I do have a question for Judine to start off with. You've talked about students feeling that they had a lower level of feeling that they're contributing to the workplace, and perhaps a lower level of feeling that they're belonging as well. And which is perhaps not surprising. A question I would have is, did the students see that as something that was overwhelmingly negative, or they made that as an observation and they were able to successfully deal with that, for lack of better words?
Yeah, I would say not overly negative. So it was a drop from the face-to-face reports, but we also asked them point blank, for those of you who made the transition to remote work, would you say it went well, yes or no? And 87% of them said yes. So that was sort of our litmus test. And then one of the pieces of analysis that we're doing now is looking at the difference in the responses for those who reported that the transition didn't go well versus the ones that reported that it did, to try to understand a little bit deeper what you're asking about, you know, what how dramatic was this decline.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating, because the student journey in this is going to be really interesting. And it's going to capture something in a moment of history that hopefully we won't repeat in any time in the near future, but that whole transitional space, to capture that as part of research data is going to be really valuable, and it's going to help inform us our thinking in the near future as well. Bonnie, if I can ask you a question. So you're in the space of designing some of this as a learning experience in that online space. Is there a particular bit of advice that you would give to other practitioners in that area, that you say, hey, look, if you're going to shift, well, we are shifting into that space, what are some of the key things to really be mindful of when it comes to the student learning experience in order to maximize that learning?
Yeah, look, a lot of the advice that I would give to educators has really just been echoed by Judine's work. So Judine, thank you so much for providing an empirical basis for this type of design work as well. So hearing that students, you know, want meaningful work and require meaningful work. This is one of the key points that I talk with educators about is, okay, let's go to the most authentic work practice. What does that look like, and how can we reimagine that for curriculum? I also ask educators to leverage partnerships. So what partnerships do you have, and how can we work with them to make it something that's beneficial for everyone? And if that means tweaking it a little bit here or there, well, then I think that's okay, because one way of working might not necessarily work for all industry partners as well. So I think having that flexibility as an educator, I think also checking in with students and checking in with industry partners, you know, all the core recommendations that we would have, which is really just goodwill practice and goodwill pedagogy, ensuring that students feel supported, and ensuring that assessments align to what they do rather than something which is outside of what they do. Yes, having opportunities for reflection and things like that, that is throughout the piece. And using a technology and a platform that will work for everybody. There may be, like, it's certainly good to advise a certain technological platform, but it's not a mandated thing. So you'll find that some organisations naturally are already on Teams or WebEx or use Zoom. And so getting the student to also work with what the organisation also uses.
Bonnie, I guess to ask a question that many of us educators are probably struggling with, this shift and different focus, is there evidence around that the resourcing required in order to make that happen, or the amount of time resourcing, that there's been a change in that space as well?
Do you know what? This is the $1 million question. We used to think the $1 million question was, do like internships produce, you know, more employable students? But the $1 million question now actually is around resourcing WIL and how much can we achieve on a shoestring. And I think that's where the space that we're at the moment. I don't have a definitive answer around resourcing. However, what we can see just by, you know, through conversations is that if a university has a strategic priority, which is around work integrated learning, well, then that just gives so much more, that enables the subject coordinators to do more around partnerships with industry and to do more around redesigning what they already have inside curriculum. So there's kind of two ways we can go with WIL in curriculum. We can design whole units, which are completely around work integrated learning, or we can look at the units that we have and think about ways that we can embed work integrated activities inside those existing curriculum courses. So the space that I'm at is in this second space. I've been in the first space, but I'm really intrigued about this second space, and this is this is where opportunities can really grow from as well. So it might not be that the work integrated learning activity encompasses like the whole student experience. It might be a portion of the student experience. But I think this is a real area of growth. And in terms of resourcing, I've just been involved in a research project around resourcing. However, we've only just collected the data on that one, and we haven't even analysed it yet. So it's a bit premature of me to speculate on what educators want in terms of resourcing. So once I'm a bit further on in that research project, I'll be able to report back to you and let you know what is required. Look, but I think we know that working with industry, not only gaining relationships, but maintaining and sustaining those relationships, it takes time. It takes a lot of time outside, you know, course materials and administration of a subject or a unit. So I think resourcing is definitely a key challenge. But number one, if it's in an institutional priority, then hopefully that filters down through to what we are able to do inside curriculum.
No, thank you, Bonnie. Resourcing is always a challenge, and it always was for work integrated learning, and perhaps that's more true now than it ever was before. But you're right, when it comes to institution, it comes around to their priorities and what it is they want to resource, and to the extent they want to resource it, and there will be our attention. Judine, there's a question for you in regards of some of the things that you're finding about the impact or transition from a conventional placement to being a remote type placement. Were you finding any demographical differences in that space? But at the same time, I'm kind of thinking perhaps, you know, about the equity space as well, that some students are perhaps more resourced in order to be able to do that. I'm not sure if you've cut the data to that level yet, but Be interested to know what does you think?
Yeah, we've done a little bit, not yet on the findings that I reported on, but we did look at the differences between the students who transitioned versus not, and there were some differences in certain programs and faculties. So in our science, engineering, applied health sciences, there were more that transition or that didn't transition to remote work than in our other faculties. Interesting to me, 60% of the ones that didn't transition were first work term students. And that really jumped out at me from the perspective of you know, first work term students tend to be more challenging for work teams in terms of giving them work and in terms of managing them. What I don't know is whether those first work term students made the decision not to continue, because that decision was available to the students. They could decide not to continue their work term, or whether those students just weren't given the opportunity to continue remotely. So that I don't have more details on, but it was very interesting to me. And there were differences in industries, not surprising to everyone on this call, and a higher percentage of those who reported as women or other didn't make the transition to remote work. So we did notice some differences in who ended up working remotely. What we haven't looked at is the experience factors by those variables. I did notice someone's asked about what happened to the 3,000 students that didn't transition. So a certain percentage of them, I think it was fairly small, stayed working in the physical locations if they were deemed to be an essential service, and they made the arrangements that was deemed to be safe. The others ended their work terms early. So there was a significant number of students who ended their work terms early.
Yeah, certainly we're finding that similar experience at our university as well, that some of the placements during the, well, was for our A semester, did terminate early, but we weren't quite sure whether or not that was because the opportunity couldn't be extended earlier, further, or whether it's just something that was a student choice. We know we had both occurring, but we just don't know the balance of that. And hopefully some of that data can be teased out later on. It certainly sounds like you've got some very rich data, so it can be really interesting to see some of those findings once the analysis is done. Just a question for Karen, if possible. I remember you talked about looking at the students' writing and seeing whether or not there were changes occurring during the writing. I couldn't quite remember if you'd done some of that analysis, but perhaps you can expand a bit on what you were finding in that particular space.
Well, it's interesting. We've looked at the reflective writing that students create in a lot of different ways. Years ago, we looked at it actually to see, because that was one stable piece of writing that we had students do, and we could look and see whether there was changes, writing growth over their time at Drexel, whether there were changes based of lots of different cohorts. That's not something we're doing now. What we're looking at now, one of the things that we're coding for, and this is interesting because it goes back to what Bonnie was talking about, and I think Judine as well, is emotion in the talking, in what they have to say. And we see that often is correlate with prosocial. So if they feel that this is meaningful, their emotion is often higher around it. And so that's pieces of what we're looking at there to see what can we understand through the writing about the experience and what's happening. One of the things that I'll be curious about when we look at the next year's, this current year's, sorry, we won't get it until January, this year's cohort is, are they writing more simply because they have a bigger story to tell? So I'm not sure whether I answered your question, but but I'm happy to try again if I didn't.
No, thank you. That's very good. And that writing around the experiences that have occurred and some of the struggles within it is a way of students realizing self-resilience and things like that. And I see just some comments around that. And funnily enough, even in my own courses, just last week, we talked about students having struggles in these spaces and even failing or not succeeding at something because of it, and how you come out of that and how that builds and enhances resilience. And that's related to the whole concept of failing forward and things like that. So, but resilience is definitely a very important space for students, always has been, but perhaps now more so than ever. I'm a little mindful of time ahead, and I would like to ask a question to Berentine, if that's possible. Berentine, you're doing the little bit of research around career choices. I didn't have an opportunity to ask if you actually seen there are differences occurring within those career choices that the students are making, or is that still data that you're collecting at the moment?
Pardon again, please. Yeah. Please repeat your question again, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just asking you, you're looking at the concept, looking at the element of career choices that students are making and the differences that might be occurring. Do you already have data in that space that is starting to show what students' choices are?
I just my research just a proposal, and I think the preliminary that I would like to propose the study about career choice will not only help to understand behavioral and cultural differences in coping strategies and career self-assessment strategies under the COVID pandemic, but will also provide important guidance for our students to develop a more highly skilled worker, resilience, and adaptive way to cope with emerging challenges in their career development process during university or school to work transition. And I think if we develop research framework based on several theories, we will understand how students think about these challenge events, such as the concept and theory about career shock, individual stress and coping theory, social cognitive theory, career development theory and work transition, and Chow's theory of career. And the result I think will show dynamic view of culture of career adjustment during unexpected events that explore the role played by positive and negative career shocks caused by COVID in predicting career confidence or career future, and also to confirm the importance of work integrated learning experience and its self-efficacy within this theory.
Thank you for that. Yes, well timed with the clock as well, I should point out. It's going to be really interesting to see what changes of expectations employers will have when it comes to competencies for graduates entering the workplace as well, because I imagine it's been a shift that's occurred in that space too. We are coming to the end of our time, as the clock reminded us. We are definitely in that whole interesting space, and there's definitely some really interesting challenges ahead for us this year. And I'm fairly sure that even though we might be optimistic that at the end of this year things will settle, I suspect our challenges that we face at the moment will likely spill into 2021 and perhaps even 2022. So there's definitely some challenges for our practice for work integrated learning. But despite these challenges, I think we should be encouraged as well. And I think we have good reason to be encouraged with where we are at, in that the universities have been able to adapt and change very quickly the challenges that occurred at the beginning of the year. And given that universities are notorious when it comes to not changing quickly, we've been able to do that very fast and be able to do it for the most part fairly successful as well. So in that regard, we're in an interesting space where universities are all of a sudden quite dynamic and quite adaptable. We've had ongoing discussions about alternative forms of work integrated learning and a shift perhaps from non-placement or from placement WIL to non-placement WIL, which is definitely the space that's a growing space. But these discussions were already occurring before COVID-19, and some of that's already published in the literature when it comes to good practice. So in that sense, we're well placed when it comes to facing the challenges that are ahead of us. And at the same time, we've got research taking place at the moment that's going to inform our thinking to making good, well-informed choices with our programs and our student learning directions that we have. And we're also very much in the fortunate position that we are a well-connected world. We've had members attending here from all across the globe as part of a webinar and sharing our ideas and our research findings and talking about good practice. And we're very fortunate to have that space. So my encouragement is for everybody to stay connected in that space and to keep connecting with webinars that are on offer for WACE and ACE and the other national associations. Just a couple of quick notices before we bring it to an end. I would encourage you to be mindful of the global WIL professional development opportunities that are available, and I'll post that link into the chat very shortly. An opportunity to have professional development and work in integrated learning is 100% online, so that's great in that regard. International Journal for Work Integrated Learning is publishing a special issue on COVID-19, or the impact of COVID-19 on work integrated learning. This is going to be quite an expanded issue, and it will be published mid-September. There will be notification that will go out through the appropriate channels, but if you want to get notifications early, I encourage you to go to the website and look on the top right. There's a blue button there, and it says Get Notifications, and you can sign up in that particular space. And lastly, if you're in an institution that perhaps is not a member of WACE, I would encourage you to have your institution become a member of WACE in order to have access to the privileges and benefits that, that WACE has to offer its members. There will be a webinar survey sent out shortly, so we're really keen to hear your views about the webinars and perhaps some directions about other topics that we can cover. And lastly, I just really want to thank the panelists for making the time available and sharing their knowledge and insights of the research that they've done in this space. So Judine, Karen, Baritine, and Bonnie, thank you so much for the time that you've made and being here and being available. Hey, look, everybody, stay healthy, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Thank you.